thought first of all we could have a quick overview of the armies that we'll be using to kind of set the scene to the battle. We'll be using today these 200 figures, which are from irregular miniatures. They are very useful for larger battles, and admittedly not to everyone's taste, but they were particularly useful for me for when I was playtesting the rules, because of course it's quite easy to assemble large armies easily. They're particularly useful in the context of this game because it is easy to make the different troop types, and in the other scales I haven't got every single troop type made yet, mainly because colleagues are doing armies which have got those units. In this battle we're going to be using a very wide selection of unit types, so that you can see how each of the different unit types function in the rules. This is not common when you're actually playing in reality, because of course most armies have a relatively small number of different troop types, and therefore you wouldn't have this kind of variety in a battle, or at least not very commonly. So let's now look at the individual contingents. This is the Protestant army, which consists of units of cavalry, 4 units of cavalry, using Swedish style tactics. These units here are Swedish brigades, which were a Swedish tactic used in the 1630s for a short time by the Swedish army. And then here we have what are called regiments in the rules. These are basically the later 30 Years' War style units, which emerged and became standard units in the English Civil War and indeed later. And then here we have Dutch style cavalry units, which is the style created by Maurice of Nassau early in the century, and was a common style used by Protestant forces and indeed all forces for a long time. Opposing them is an army consisting of here. This army is based on the army of the Catholic League in the first part of the 30 Years' War. Most famously that's led by Tilly. So we have some large old style tercios, they're called early tercios in the rules, and then the cavalry consists of a front line of cuirassiers. You might be able to tell they're quite black from the armour, and backed by some arquebusiers. You'll notice that what I've done is I have varied the number of figures and blocks and styles, so you can tell the different style. So you can see here these are Dutch style, and they're in 2 ranks with 6 blocks, whereas here the cuirassiers are in 6 blocks with 3. The arquebusiers are in 4 blocks but with 4 deep, and the Swedish cavalry, if you recall, they were 4 blocks but with 2 deep. This unit here is a unit of light cavalry, Croatians very typically for this period, but possibly from other kinds. They will be fighting with an army from the Imperialist side. So these units here are the more common tercios of the period, which are basically very similar to the regiments but a lot deeper. And then also we have some more cuirassiers and arquebusiers. As I said, there's many different kinds of units in this battle, but you won't necessarily use them all the time. And in addition we have artillery and baggage elements, and of course commanders. Okay. So the different kinds of units have different advantages and disadvantages, and were also used by different armies. So the early tercios, these were typically used by Tilly's armies, Tilly's Catholic armies, in the early part of the war, and they have additional morale failures, more about that later, compared to other units. They're kind of tougher than other units, but they're big and unmanoeuvrable. These are tercios, which were very common in Catholic armies through most of the war, but disappeared towards the end, and also used by some others. They're kind of a little bit of a light version of the early tercios. They're smaller, more manoeuvrable, and still a little bit tough, but not as tough as the earlier tercios, and also not as unmanoeuvrable. These largely disappeared towards the end of the 30 Years' War as all armies moved to regiments. These are regiments. They're relatively small, relatively flexible units which were used by many of the Protestant armies during the period and became standard for all armies towards the end. Finally, we have the Swedish brigades. As you can see, the Swedish brigades are a complicated arrangement of units which was extremely flexible but required a great deal of training, so it only existed for a short period of the intervention of Sweden into the war in the 1630s, but it's extremely flexible. Each of the units is rated for the type of unit it is, but also it is rated for the number and composition of weapons that it's got within the unit. So most units, infantry units of this period, are a mixture of shot, muskets and pikes, and so units are given a rating which reflects that. So for example, for the sake of this battle, I'm going to rate these units, the Protestant units, as musket heavy. That means that they have got roughly 2 shot, 2 muskets to 1 pike, and I'll also rate the tercios as 2 muskets to 1 pike, which is musket heavy. The early tercios and the Swedish brigade I'm going to rate as mixed musket X. That means that they have approximately 3 muskets to 2 pikes. For the Swedish brigades, this is a bit of a sort of false reading, because one of the advantages of the Swedish brigade is that they can change the ratio by altering the formation they're in to effectively place the muskets in the front line, or more of the muskets in the front line, or more of the pikes in the front line, which then alters the effective ratio of the unit overall. Let's now have a look. So the different cavalry units use different styles of tactics. These are the Dutch cavalry, Dutch style cavalry. They dated from the reforms of Maurice of Nassau of the Dutch republics, and they emphasise using firepower to disrupt attacks or to soften up targets, and then charging in after that has succeeded. You'll see here these units, which are, as I mentioned, are deeper. They are cuirassiers. They are, contrary to usual opinion, they charge into attack and rarely use firepower, and they have extra armour and also represent more men. These are supporting arquebusiers, which at that time were still using firepower, and their aim was to support the cuirassiers in their attacks, but not to engage in melee. There's a small unit of Croatians. They're light horse, and their classic job is to harass and get around the flank of the enemies. The last unit types are Swedish cavalry. These are a new kind which were introduced during the war by the Swedes based on their experience in fighting in other wars, and became one of the standard cavalry tactics of the era following. They are more aggressive and something like the cuirassiers tactics, but the actual cavalry themselves are lighter armed, on smaller horses, and with less armour. You may notice, or may have noticed, that there are, for example, here 4 Swedish cavalry fighting against 3 Catholic cavalry, and then on the other side similar story. We have 5 Dutch cavalry against 4 Catholic cavalry, and numerical advantage all across the line. Each of the contingents are in fact equal, because each of the different unit types represent a different number of men. So, for example, here these infantry regiments represent approximately 1,000 men each, so that's 4,000 men, and these tertiaries represent approximately 2,000 men each, so that's again 4,000. So this is about 2,500 cavalry, and so is this about 2,500 cavalry, and then similarly across the line. So one of the advantages of the later unit types is that you tend to have more units for the number of men that are in the real army, and they also are more flexible, as in they don't tend to have trouble manoeuvring. So, for example, both cuirassiers and arquebusiers on the Catholic side do not manoeuvre as well as the Protestant kinds of units. Units are further distinguished by their ratings based on their ability. I frequently use ratings based on a random dice roll to decide what the unit's rating will be, but for today's game, and to keep it simple, I've assigned them and will use markers so that you can keep track of which units are which. You don't necessarily need to do this, because of course each of the units represent individual real units, and normally I wouldn't bother with markers. I would just keep a record of who is who on some kind of army list, but for the purpose of this I'm going to use different markers. So for example, I'm going to put a green marker on this cavalry here, and a red marker on here, and another one on here. So the green marker represents the fact that this unit is raw, and the red markers here represent the fact that these two units are elite. Units are rated as either elite, trained or raw, so all of the units which do not have these markers are trained. I will put the other markers on in a moment. Okay, so I've now placed the additional markers on. As you can see, the German Protestant allies here have quite a few green markers. The Swedes have a couple of elite units, a couple of red units and a green unit. Imperialists over there have a green unit, and as I said before, they have a mixture in today's army of veterans and the green unit. You'll also notice that I've placed a dice next to the commanders, so you can see that we have 4 commanders which are rated as 1, and the Swedish commander is rated as a 2. The command ratings go from 0 to 3, with 0 being basically fairly incompetent, 1 being average, 2 being above average, and 3 would be someone who is really extremely good. So we're talking Gustavus Adolphus or Cromwell, or someone who's a well-known name and well-known military leader. In addition, units can have additional characteristics, and for the sake of this game, I'm going to use a few of them. Cavalry can have small numbers of infantry, musketeers, assigned to them to help them in their combat. So these are called commanded shot, and for this what I do is I place small units of musketeers like so on the base to represent them. They can be lost, so it is important that they can be taken off at any point during the game. Similarly, the Swedish units, and some of the units as well, often had attached small guns, which they were called regimental guns at the time. So I'm going to put on here some small guns like so to represent them. Here we go. Okay, so they also can be lost, so it's useful to have markers. So units can be rated in many different ways, and as I said, this is quite a complicated setup because I've tried to give you a selection of different unit types that you can have. So don't worry if it seems a bit overwhelming. In the vast majority of cases, you're not going to have as many troop types or as many different variations, because basically they only exist in certain armies at certain periods and in limited amounts of time. So I'll now set up the game proper and deploy the armies.